Welcome back to another edition of Literary Diss Tracks. Today we have John Irving, author of The World According to Garp, and John Cheever, probably most known for his short stories like The Swimmer, versus J.P. Donleavy, author of The Ginger Man. Now, this one hits close to home for me. I don't have any of my own literary feuds per se. However, there is a notable writer who I've developed a distaste for as a result of an interaction very similar to the one I'm about to share with y'all. If you're curious who that is, well, stay curious. Anyways, this story raises that evergreen question of how a writer ought to pursue their art. Must you suffer for your art, making it your sole focus in life, or can you succeed as a writer artistically alongside other pursuits, including your general well-being? But also just some good old-fashioned pettiness in this one. I'm going to weigh in on the matter at the end because, as you'll see, this stuff just gets my blood boiling. Enjoy. In the early 1970s, both John Irving and John Cheever were teaching at the Iowa Writers' Workshop, perhaps the most famed MFA program in the country, then and now. Other writers who held positions in the Iowa Writers' Workshop include the likes of Kurt Vonnegut Jr., Flannery O'Connor, and Raymond Carver. In many ways, the Iowa Writers' Workshop is most responsible for the distinct stylings that we've come to associate with literary fiction in America, for better or for worse. I'll leave that to y'all to argue about in the comments. The Iowa Writers' Workshop also brings in guest writers to give readings and visit classes. One of them was J.P. Donleavy. John Irving is tasked with picking Donleavy up from the airport, and I'm going to let Irving describe that meeting as he would relate it to the Paris Review. Quote, "I didn't expect Donleavy to have read anything of mine, but I was surprised when he announced that he read no one living. Then he asked if we were in Kansas. I told him a little about the workshop, but he was one of those writers with no knowledge about writing programs and many prejudices about them. To be a student of writing was a waste of time. Better to go out and suffer." In a meeting with workshop students, he told them that any writer who was lowering himself by teaching writing wasn't capable of teaching them anything. Here's where Cheever enters into the picture. As Irving recounts, quote, "Cheever tried a few times to engage Donleavy in some conversation, and as Cheever was as gifted in conversation as any man I've ever met, I grew more and more furious at Donleavy's coldness and unresponsiveness and total discourtesy. I was thinking, frankly, that I should throw the lout in a puddle, if there was one handy, when Cheever spoke up. 'Do you know, Mr. Donleavy,' Cheever said, 'that no major writer of fiction was ever a shit to another writer of fiction, except Hemingway, and he was crazy.' As a side note here, I'm not sure about the claim that no major writer of fiction was especially cruel to another writer, but the call out to Hemingway feels pretty earned here if you've been keeping up with the diss tracks." Irving continues, quote, "Donleavy had no answer. Perhaps he thought Hemingway was still a living writer and therefore hadn't read him either." Irving then goes on to just sort of excoriate Donleavy as both righteous and a prima donna, and then he closes by saying, quote, "If the story embarrasses him or makes him angry, I would say we're even. The evening embarrassed Cheever and me, and made us angry too." Donleavy responds to Irving not too long after, noting that his recollection of events is somewhat different. Weirdly, a lot of his issues with Irving's account is how Irving described what Donleavy was wearing at the time. But aside from that, Donleavy writes, quote, "I suggested to him that if he had the option to leave the cozy world of teaching, it was better to go suffer and pursue a writing career outside of university. As for snubbing Mr. John Cheever, I distinctly recall pleasantly meeting this distinguished gentleman in his classroom during one of his teaching sessions." However, Donleavy does admit to some of the critiques Irving posed, writing, quote, "It is true that I do not have untold sympathy for the American academic fraternity, nor did I keep up with the literary scene then, nor do I now." Irving would later respond in the Paris Review with an apology to the readers, writing, quote, "I'm sorry you had to suffer that arcane and mannered flapdoodle from Mr. Donleavy. If we were to dilute this literary feud, we might say that the moral of the story is to simply be polite to other writers when they are being polite to you. But if I may get on my soapbox for just a second, I'll add to this. Do not listen to any writer who would tell you that to be a writer, you must pursue it at the cost of all else, including other professions or your mental well-being. I've had enough of that tortured and starving artist junk, because we have seen many times writers who pursue a career, maybe even have a family if they so choose, and also have successful and or fulfilling writer careers and lives. And by the way, writers who teach writing are not writers who have forfeited going out into the world and honing their skills. They are writers who, in many cases, are fortunate enough to have multiple passions and the opportunity to teach. So, my personal bias aside, still let me know in the comments who you got in this one: John Irving, John Cheever, or J.P. Donleavy.